What is consent?
Consent is verbally agreeing to a vibe that you think you have. You've got a bit of an energy or there's something going on here, but consent is when you say it out loud that this is what we're here for, we're both on board for this, and we're keen.
Consent is, to be honest, I don't know. I've always heard of it in the sexual context, so it's basically approval of one's partner to pursue some physically, I guess.
Consent is when two people are in love or like each other like a lot.
What is consent? Consent is an easy question. Is it okay? And when it's not okay, what do you do? Nothing. Because it's not okay. And don't forget to say to a friend or a random homie that consent is as easy as 3 little words. Let's make sure everyone knows what consent really is by sharing this video so we can all ask, is it okay?
While we are still waiting for more people to join us, we've got about 48 in the room. We have registered over 100 people. So I'll just play another one short part 2 of that video, and then we'll go ahead and get started right after. Thank you.
Is it okay? And when it's not okay, what do you do? Nothing. Because it's not okay. And don't forget to say to a friend or a random homie that consent is as easy as 3 little words. Let's make sure everyone knows what consent really is by sharing this video so we can all ask, is it okay?
Good afternoon again, and once again, welcome to today's symposium on shifting the economic power, a feminist economic strategy to address gender-based violence. We are a collaboration of civil society organizations that participated in the interim steering committee on GBV. And we are pleased to have all of you joining us today for this very important discussion. Those organizations that are participating in this initiative and hosting you today is the Teddy Bear Foundation, which many of you are familiar with in the space, NISA Institute for Women's Development, Masimanyane, and Wise for Africa. My name is Onika Nontlantla Makwakwa. I'm one of the directors at Wise for Africa, also known as the Wise Collective. I'm not sure. Can someone please mute? Apologies. Please, just for housekeeping, can you please be reminded to mute our computers speaking? I'm going to ask for admin to please assist me in making sure everyone is muted. Thank you. So I will go back to just the introduction that you are being hosted today by the Teddy Bear Foundation, NISA Institute for Women's Development, Masimanyane, and Wise for Africa. I am not going to speak for too long. I just want to quickly move us along the program today so I can introduce you to who will actually be speaking. I am going to project the agenda at the moment so you are able to see who is scheduled to be speaking. May I please ask everyone to mute kindly? Thank you. So we have that. As part of this collaboration of civil society organizations that were part of the interim steering committee, we, of course, were involved in the development of the National Strategic Plan, which was since adopted by government at the end of April in 2020. One of the aspects of the National Strategic Plan is Chapter 5, Pillar 5, which actually deals with the issue of economic power. And so today our focus is mainly being to further dive into this area of economic power and begin to explore what kind of response and what we actually really mean by shifting the economic power as a strategy towards ending gender-based violence. And as part of that, we commissioned an economist and researcher, Busi Sibeko, who I am going to now invite to get ready to share her screen so she can make the presentation on the research paper that she developed as part of this initiative. Busi, are you there? Are you able to share your screen, or should we?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. Please try and share your screen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm unable. Yes, I can't share this right now. I'm unable to, so I think I need administrative.
Okay, admin, please.
Capabilities to do.
Are you? Can someone please?
Let me try now. Okay, I still can't share, but I'll just keep trying. Still can't.
You still are not able to. Okay, Ritabila, are you able to share Busi's screen, please? Busi's presentation.
Yeah, so she has indicated that she will share the screen.
Okay, all right.
Yes, I just need, it says the host has disabled screen sharing, so I just need the settings to be able to do so.
Okay, Busi, let me see if I can enable you. Busi, I've just assigned you as the host.
Yes, I see now.
Share now.
Yes, I can share it. Can I actually share my screen now? Okay, let's just get this.
Onika, can you Onika, can you try and mute people, please?
Okay, I've just done that. Anyway, good morning, everyone. My name is Sibeko, and I'm a researcher and economist who has been tasked with this great task of looking at the GBVF NSP and to look at it through a feminist economics lens to see if it sufficiently challenges power. And I'll be going through this presentation with you all and to really unpack what the findings were. Again, to say that the aim of the paper was one, to foster a deeper understanding of the interlinkages between GBVF and economic inequality and at what it needs for the key interventions proposed by the NSP. And again, like I've already said, it was to apply a feminist economics lens to produce a preliminary gap analysis of whether these proposed interventions would sufficiently challenge power and stop the reproduction of power. And this was particularly through a lens that looks at violence as market, state, and interpersonal against women. So economic violence is violence in this definition of power. So the paper itself, which I won't be going through the presentation the way the paper is exactly structured, and we'll be focusing more on the gap analysis. But the structure of the paper is, of course, an introduction into what this paper is about, the feminist economics approach, which outlines what is feminist economics and what is meant by that. I'll be going through that in this presentation. There's a literature review, which is theory and evidence from feminist economists globally, continentally, locally, on what they've found around certain topics. For example, what has happened through the feminization of labor, meaning as more women have joined the labor force over time, what are the findings they're finding in their research? And so I scope quite a lot of that work across the board. Look at South Africa's economy, so existing macroeconomic indicators, the labor force, business participation, and so forth. And then there's a gap analysis of the interventions themselves, which links back to the literature review, and that's how they analyzed. And this is where I'll be focusing my presentation today. And then there's a way forward, which then gives proposals for what needs to be done to really challenge economic power. So what is the feminist economics approach? So feminist economics is very specific. It is a school of thought which has emerged in the 1970s, which was a challenge to mainstream economics, the economics that we taught, the economics that is generally practiced, the economics that we see in South Africa. And the whole purpose is that it emerged from a Marxian approach, which was an idea that we need to think about power in a different way, and that we need to take power differentials seriously, but also we need to merge it with the feminist approach, which is to say that, yes, Marx focused on power differentials between workers and capitalists, but actually we also need to look at the household as a sphere where power is reproduced. And so these are sort of the core things I've lifted that are critical to this understanding from the paper. Of course, like I said, this is more extensive in that. So one is to acknowledge that households are internally fragmented sites, right, with power differentials. While gender is an ideological and cultural construct, it is also reproduced within the realm of material practices. And what does that mean? It means that in turn, it influences the outcomes of such practices. Gender relations play a systematic role in the division of labor, work, of work, paid and unpaid. So who takes care of the children, who goes into the labor market, who does the cooking. It plays a role in income distribution within the household, wealth, education, productive inputs that enable people to make a living and so forth, and publicly provisioned goods. So we have different access, depending on our gender, to what public good entitlements we have. The strict division of roles in the domestic sphere constrains women's public participation and their access to economic opportunities, and in turn, and in the market. So in turn, creating inequalities in the household, and bargaining power being a critical one. So one of the greatest contributions of feminist economics has been this idea of, within the household, bargaining power and is negotiated along different lines, right? It's not altruism. So that means that we mustn't assume in economics that just because on average a household has 50,000 Rand, that every single person in that household, gets a share of that amount in equal terms, and that everybody has got the same ability to access that money. It could be that there's one person in the household who consumes the 50,000 Rand and leaves everybody else hungry. And that is important to understand in the way that we understand the economy itself, because households is where social reproduction, meaning that how we are created as labor, starts at the household. Busi is Busi here because somebody took care of Busi. My mother took care of me, cooked for me, sent me to school, and those decisions were made, even if not necessarily explicitly, but there were powered dimensions to how we decide. And in developing countries, for example, it can be the difference between who goes to school and who doesn't. The girl child stays home to do the work of taking care of the elderly, the sickly, and children, and then the boy child goes to school, because again, it's also around social constructs of what we believe. But to say that bargaining power at the household level is influenced by assets, which are means of production that generate income, serve as collateral for loans, and act as a buffer during emergencies. And bargaining power is also determined by the ability to store wealth and means of status and social advantage. So therefore, it is important that violence be understood through these economic, social, and political structures. And it was also deeply, deeply historical. It is important that in whatever feminist economic analysis that is undertaken, that the historical, how did South Africa become South Africa today? It was through, exploitative capitalistic exploitation, which meant that there were Bantusans, which meant that, Black women did the reproducing of the labor power, which meant that Black women also did the reproducing of white families, in particular, in the way that it was. And these structures, across time, these processes change. However, it is important that our starting point is that we understand these power differentials and where they emerge and how they change over time. But also to say that feminist economics is very critical, therefore, of patriarchy and capitalism in itself. And so we need to understand the states and markets as well as being critical to this. There's a very beautiful model, which I haven't included here, because most of us, I don't like seeing models as much as I'm an economist, but that shows the interaction between the state, market, household, and community in how power and the economy functions. It is not how we've been taught in traditional economics, which is that, there's the market and there's sort of like the household, but to say that there's an extensive amount of social relations that go into how economic power is reproduced and generated. So that is the angle from which, I was approaching this from. And to say that in the South African context, as I've already mentioned, the history is very important. Where are we now in the current economy? We've got a 43.2% unemployment rate. We know that unemployment in our country is class-based. We know that mostly it's Black people. We know that it is, it's also age-related. The youth, 7 out of 10 of our youth are unemployed. We also know that it's geographic, meaning that, if you live in certain parts of the country, Eastern Cape and the rural areas, and Limpopo and other areas, we know that you are less likely to be in employment. And so intersectionality and understanding our unemployment figures is very important. But that also has played a factor in what we see right now. The amount of jobs that have been lost have been largely by women, Black women in particular have always been vulnerable in the labor market. And that is because Black women are disproportionately represented in precarious work, in underpaid work, and so forth. Underemployment is also an emerging issue that I think we need to pay more attention to globally. Is to say that, yes, we might be seeing increasing number of people being employed, but there are more and more people who are actually, one, either not working the job that they trained for, if they desire to work in that job, but also two, to say that there are going to be many people after this crisis who are probably going to be working less hours than what they should be. There's climate considerations that we need to think about in our South African context. You know, climate issues do impact women disproportionately as well. As a, you know, for example, when we think about water crises and so forth, it is detrimental to social reproductive work. When you think about lockdowns, which are, you know, to stop the spread, but to think about how they exacerbate the economic conditions of our country and how that then plays out. One, the fact that people are physically home, but also two, how it exacerbates the economic conditions of the household and how that perpetuates further GBVF. We know that in South Africa, more than half of our population lives in poverty, and so forth. And we could go on and on. But what feminist economists are saying now is that, in fact, this crisis is not just a crisis of health, but is fundamentally a crisis of social reproduction. Because as more and more people have been home, the unpaid care work has become more visible. But also we need to understand households differently. Households are economies in a way, if you think of it that way, to say that households are places where production also happens. Cooking is a productive activity, even though it is not considered so in, you know, for example, your GDP statistics. So to think differently about households. And so in South Africa, when we think about what does the crisis of social reproduction look like, we've got a lot of data that has shown what is happening, for example, in ECD centers. ECD centers are closing down. A lot of them have not reopened. What happens when feeding schemes in schools are closed? What happens to those children? What happens when women aren't able to fully access certain services? Are some of the things that we need to think about. And so we need to think differently about our economy, because it obviously links deeply into some of these ills. We know, of course, economic power is one of the elements of GBV. It's of course not the only one. And so I just want to emphasize that here, and to also say that as a sort of disclaimer, to say as much as feminist economics is interested in intersectional analysis, there is a limitation because we fundamentally don't have the information that would require to produce that kind of analysis, and data being one of the key hindrances. You know, we don't know enough about certain groups, and it is much needed. And so even though there's an attempt to make you know, intersectional analysis as best as possible, there are real limitations in that way, and we need to think differently about that. So coming to the Pillar 5 interventions, taking into account, I've given you a brief feminist economics outline, but it is of course longer, and I'm going to check my time because I don't like to be that person. But to say that Pillar 5 is obviously centered around 5 outcomes over the next 5 years, four outcomes rather, and it is accelerated initiatives that address women's unequal economic and social position through access to government and private sector procurement, employment, housing, access to land, financial resources, and other income generating activities. Safe workplaces that are free of violence against women and LGBTQI+ persons, including not limited to sexual harassment, demonstrated commitment through policy interventions by the South African state, private sector, and other key stakeholders to eliminate the impact of economic drivers of GBV, strengthened child maintenance and related support systems to address economic vulnerability of women. So the outcome, I think it's always important that we both understand what the interventions are and what the outcome is, because in the end, and I'm sort of, you know, already alluding to the conclusion, is that it is important that we understand what is the theory of change. how is this outcome generated from these interventions themselves? And so the expected outcome of the interventions outlined below, which I'll show you, are that women, children, and LGBTQI persons are able to be free in public spaces, use transport freely, and access resources that enable them to make healthy choices in their lives. I mean, if you ask me, I think this outcome in itself is not sufficient to deal with the economic power or the unequal power that we see in our country as it currently exists. So the first intervention, again, is to accelerate initiatives, and I won't go through that closely, but to say that to develop, implement, the key activities here was to develop, implement, support, and monitor programs for equitable job creation, representation, and ownership by women. And the indicator was the number of programs implemented for equitable job creation. My analysis here was that it is, difficult to do this. And the challenge here is that we need to think about long-run supply development and short-term, demand. So what is important, again, is this idea that we need actually comprehensive macroeconomic, sectoral, social, and cohesive labor forces. This is not possible if we do not have very deliberate policies that structurally transform our economy, right? So you can develop these for job creation. But what is actually the plan? How does this fit into the larger plans for job creation? And in fact, the job creation programs in our country currently are not sufficient. And to say that if we try to increase employment through the traditional routes, which are, founded on patriarchy and racial capitalism, what is the outcome? We mainstream women into these processes that are already flawed. And again, the indicator does not define what equitable job creation is. What does that mean? Specifically in a country where women are 52% of the population, what is equitable? Would it be better if women, what does that look like is missing there? Public-private partnerships is another key activity, but one of the critiques here is to show that public partnerships can be a useful tool, but that we actually need to do more research on how they're fared in achieving similar outcomes to the ones anticipated by this GBVF NSP. So they sound good in theory, but also to remember that public-private partnerships have had a lot of negative outcomes in the past. And to give an example, to say that, what does it look like when private sector enters into the care economy? What does it look like when private sector prioritizes profit? Can we then be able to afford to take our children to creches and things like that? So to always contextualize it within this realm of what private sector is, but also to remember that private sector is not innocent, that in fact people who are employed in our country, a majority of them, or over 54% of them in 2015, actually earned below the working poverty line. So to hold private sector more to account. There's also issues around or key activities around reconfiguring land and agrarian reform to put shelters in the interim. And I'll quickly go through this to say that the one is that there's been heavy critique from a lot of African feminist agrarians who've actually questioned this idea of agrarian reform as a productive move. So what does it mean when we think about people need land, and it doesn't always have to be that Busi is going to get this land so that she can now upscale and create a large profit-making firm. And in fact, we need to think differently about access to land that is not attached to capitalism. And again, remembering that capitalist approach was to really move people off their land, right? It is part of the capitalistic accumulation was to dispossess people of land. So we need to think about also distribution, redistribution, and social production when we think about land reforms. And again, in terms of the housing, the critique there was that interim housing is not sufficient in a country where our government, builds RDPs. It is sort of, why not just give women households? What happens after that interim period? And this whole activity relies on women then getting jobs, which again is also this question of, okay, fine, you want these women to go into this exploitative infrastructure where they might be underpaid and be in precarious employment, and then you want them to move out of this interim housing. So it is not sufficient, and a more, stronger policy needs to put there. Establish survivor-focused cooperative groups to build entrepreneurship, healing, and economic resilience. And so, again, referring to this private partnerships, it's heavily quoted in this paper in itself, but to say that, we must always think of the limitations and the threats of sometimes private partnership in particular programs, particularly like this one. Of course, yeah, so the grouping of entrepreneurship, healing, and economic resilience is problematic because it assumes, it's almost like conflating this idea that healing must be done with entrepreneurship, and again, these traditional ways of thinking about how women must operate in the economy to be fully empowered. And so I won't go through, okay, there we go. The next one, put policy mechanism in place to address range of gender-related inequalities in the economy. This, to me, the key activity was very vague. It also requires really a strongly multidisciplinary approach that takes into account all these things that I've mentioned: unpaid care work, rules, norms, societal structures, institutions. And in fact, I propose that maybe a baseline study should be an appropriate start to think about what are these mechanisms. So we actually don't know what the plan is for that. Develop systems and accountability measures of maintenance defaulting. Here, the critique was to say that we actually also need more data. We don't know, for example, what happens if we mandate men by force to pay maintenance. If men had to go to jail, for example, for not paying maintenance, we don't actually know what the causal effect on GBVF itself would be. And so there's some anecdotal evidence, but this really needs, women's lives are at risk here, so we cannot propose policies that might actually be detrimental. The next intervention, so these are grouped in three. The next one is make workplaces safe and violence-free for all women. And so the two interventions are workplace interventions for GBV support developed and rolled out in the public and private sector. And the other one is to develop sexual harassment policies in workplaces across the public and private sectors. And so the fundamental gaps in this policy is that, again, it's this question of theory of change. What is it that we envision will happen through this, right? And to say there's the theoretical, there's a methodological approach here. And so it is unclear what is actually meant to happen. And measuring whether workplaces have enforceable sexual harassment policies is likely not really possible. I mean, they could produce a document that says we have this policy, but at the end of the day, you don't, the state will not know whether it is fully enforced, how it's enforced, whether it's inequitable, who's in power. Again, these policies have also power dynamics. When you work for someone, there's a power dimensions, even in the workforce, that need to be considered themselves, and who will also develop these policies? Is it co-created? Is it, feminist groups? Who does that? The last grouping, and I'll wrap up here, and I've gone over time, strategic policy interventions by state, private sector, and other key sectors rolled out towards eliminating the impact of the economic drivers of GBVF on all women. So I won't go too much into this, but the first one is about unpaid labor, raising awareness. And as you can imagine, the critique there is that women's unpaid work is undervalued and not compensated. And so raising awareness does not resolve that issue. Raising awareness does not result in a radical redistribution of unpaid care work, and that is critical. And so Seguino 2019, she says that greater gender equality and output growth is more likely when 1, women and men share unpaid domestic and care work more equally, 2, gender wage gaps are small and an extensive high quality paid care sector exists, and 4, there's sufficient investment in infrastructure to reduce unpaid care and domestic work. So way more needs needs to be done to address this issue of unpaid care work beyond awareness. And so here the indicator is percentage of time spent, but what do you do with that indicator? We could say that women spend 5 times more time than men on unpaid care work, but the indicator itself is not sufficient to really change or to induce the change we want. The monitoring of GRP, BM, and EA rollout specifically in the economic cluster. Again, this requires a consistent baseline framework. To what degree are targets integrated into these plans? Also requires a baseline work to know what targets are, but also monitoring and evaluation are critical. And ensure the implementation. And I actually want to go back to this to say that South Africa was one of the first countries to pioneer gender responsive budgeting, and it effectively didn't take off. So there are many lessons to be learned there around these sorts of proposals. Ensure the implementation of the Employment Equity Act. And I think here, just to quickly summarize, to say that one of the things is to say that we need to think about wage disparity, wage structures along horizontal and vertical lines, and to think about them again within this capitalistic institution, which is profit-led and not wage-led. The structure that thrives on, reducing wages as best as possible to maximize profit, and to also think about, for example, the disparity between CEO salaries and the cleaner at a factory, and to think more systematically around that. So to resolve the woman's question in here is to actually think about the structure of wages holistically in itself. And there's been some proposals there. I also say that, collective bargaining is something that is not mentioned here. How do we strengthen collective bargaining, such that there's a framework where women have more bargaining power? It's also difficult for women to go and, say that I'm getting less than so-and-so. But to say that if we can think differently about collective bargaining guidelines and so forth, we can think differently as well. And I think here, okay, repeating there, public employment opportunities. So here it is about the public sector, I agree, can play a critical role in absorbing unemployed youth, women, and persons with disabilities into its economy. The EPWP in South Africa, though, pays below the minimum wage, the national minimum wage. So that is a critique in itself to say that, even though women might be employed in this more, but we also know that these people are not even earning the wage that they should be earning, which is, problematic in itself. And these contradictions must be addressed. And to also say that, again, this issue of women, the social productive work, the unpaid care work burden will always be there for women. So actually creating more job opportunities in a way without adequately addressing the unpaid care work issue does not really resolve women's double burden, really, of the workforce, of joining workforce because of pressures of a capitalistic society, but also still having to do that social productive work and productive work in the households as well. And also to say that over the next 5 years, the National Treasury will be reducing the public wage bill in the budget. So I'm not sure how this works. How do you expand a program while the budget is decreasing over time? The broadening of ownership. Again, women make up, 51% of the population. So 40% is obviously not enough. And also to say that there are heavy critiques on SMME-led growth models, particularly the way that they've been positioned in the neoliberal capitalistic process. And so it is important that we also rethink this idea that, SMMEs will fundamentally change our economy, which has been always put forward. And I think I might be towards the last one. And to say here, they want to create a disability index and a gender inequality index. And I argue that indices are important for contextualizing inequalities. But, what are these indices going to help us to do? What is it that we're going to change with it? So data is great, but what is the data for? And implement the intervention to address GBVF vulnerabilities of farm workers, mine workers, and domestic workers. And this is very critical because we know that these people are particularly vulnerable. But again, laws and policy interventions need to be considered taking into account the power relations between, superiors and labor. Again, when someone is a domestic worker in their household, we do not see these interactions. We are not there. Policy and laws can only go so far. And so to think differently about that and how to regulate work that happens in private spheres. And this is the actual last one, the finalization of the legislative process to decriminalize sex work. I argue that this is obviously a positive intervention, but the decriminalization alone is not adequate. Decriminalization, to be meaningful, needs to be accompanied with the recognition of sex work, allowing sex work to be governed by labor law and protections similar to other work. And we can go on and on about how people in sex work who are sex workers deserve the same benefits, UIF, TERS, and all these other things that people who are employed in traditional sectors get. But to say that, to conclude, and I've gone through a lot, I know, but the paper will be there to read and digest. But to say that we are in a crisis, and we're in a crisis because we've seen how economy is faring during COVID. We're in a crisis because we are now in lockdown level 4 with no emergency rescue measures. We're in a crisis because we know that hunger in households is increasing. We know that the economic bargaining power of women is declining as they lose jobs, as they don't have access to certain benefits and entitlements. But then again, this is part of that issue and why feminist economics was fundamentally important, to say that women do not get the same entitlements by design. And so I conclude to say that the systematic interventions are not clear. There's no clear theory how all these things I've just gone through with you work together to collaboratively change the economic status of women. And it is unclear how these things work together, again, like I said, to ensure that there are no reproduced inequalities. But Lynn Osome, who is someone I really admire, asks these fundamental questions about how we understand economics. She says, how might we approach the question of violence as an economic problem? Violence is structured by the political economy. What is it that lends violence, particularly gendered violence, to the workings of the state and the market, to the political economy? So what does violence, how does it serve the state to actually have GBVF? And maybe in answering that, we might have an answer to why there hasn't been adequate response to the GBVF crisis in this current context. How do we explain the ways in which violence reinforces itself over time? That is, violence is a historical social problem that is reproduced over time. What are the imperatives of the state? What is the function as a political entity and as a social one? How might we understand the relationship between state and its subjects? How does the capitalistic state govern women? And this is very important, especially when talking about sex work, right? How does the state govern women and the work that they do and so forth? And again, to say that these are theoretical and methodological questions that we need to think about when we think about violence. And I'm hoping Duma will speak more about this, but to say that funding, where is the funding to give legs to this plan in itself? And to me, critically, is that there are real omissions in the plan, which include the informal economy, income transfers. For example, why can't we think of increasing the child grant as one of the measures that could be an economic empowerment tool? Tax policy, the fact that women and men do not pay the same tax incidence and across the various intersections. Interventions to strengthen critical institutions, right? So the enforcement of existing regulation. We can all argue that South Africa, has the laws that says you shouldn't discriminate against women, but again, we probably might likely see a motherhood penalty across board when we look at sectors and how much women are paid after after having children or not. So how about enforcing these, amongst many other things? So I think there are many great ideas that have come out of South Africa in our regulation and policy, but some of them are not being enforced adequately, which reproduces some of these issues. Even when thinking about SAPS, which is a budget issue as well, which I hope Duma will cover again. And again, I think there's a lack of connection to the outcome on economic power. Women, children, and LGBTQI+ persons are able to be free in public spaces. I don't know if these recommendations deal with public spaces. Use transport freely. There's no mention of transport funding, government funding in this particular chapter to how public provisioning of services, of transport services, for example, will do this and access resources that enable them to make healthy choices in their lives. And I think, yeah, so there's no mention of these things. But another fundamental concluding remark I make is that, we also cannot think about this economic power chapter as only being an onus on women. It mentions women a lot, but what about the men? When we think about the radical redistribution of land, men are generally the holders of land. So this section on economic power does not directly address what men have to do, what do men have to concede in terms of economic power, and they are the holders of economic power currently because of the patriarchy and the capitalism. And so this puts largely a focus on women, but also to caution against always thinking about women as mothers, to say that, we need to think women are not a homogenous group, and LGBTQI+ is not a homogenous group. People living with disabilities are not homogenous, and to say that, there's also sometimes a tendency to focus on policies that only address women who have children, which is very important, but to also think holistically about that. How does this plan respond to those other groups that are not the main in here? But to say that a rethink is needed with this plan. They are all, some of them are good ideas, but the question is, will they systematically, as a group of policy interventions, challenge economic power? And my argument would be no, they will not. And that's because some of the policy recommendations themselves are flawed, but also to say holistically, it is not obvious how these things work together to fundamentally challenge power. Thank you all for listening. I know that was very long, and I tried to make it as short as possible. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Busi, for that very insightful presentation for us here today. It seems like we finally have a full room, and sorry to those of you who've had to wait in the waiting room a little bit longer, but we've just had the presentation from Busi. Before we move to the discussion, which will be moderated by Advocate Brenda Madumise, I am going to make a request. If all of us can kindly switch on our cameras, we would like to take a group picture. So just indulge us for a few minutes. Hopefully it takes just 2 minutes to do that. So I'm gonna switch to the gallery. Admin, please assist me in capturing the screens. We've got about 5 screens that we have to capture, since we have about 83 people in the room right now. So please make sure we can see you. Lee Mukwena, we see your head. Come into the camera, and we will do screen grabs very quickly of this. Thank you very much for indulging us in this process. If you don't want to switch on your camera, you can make sure that you have a picture that can be included in here, and then we'll quickly. I still see a lot of people who don't have their cameras on, but that's okay. So, okay, you were here. So I hope somebody else is also taking pictures so that we can have a variety to select from. Okay, all right, last one. And we are done. Thank you very much. You can switch off your camera if you need to, in order to preserve your own bandwidth here. I am now going to ask you to please help me welcome WISE co-director Brenda Madumise-Pajibo, who is going to lead the next session for us to have a conversation to further dive into the matter, this particular topic. So Brenda, over to you. Oh, sorry, before Brenda, just one quick announcement. I know a number of you have been asking about Busi's presentation. Yes, certainly we will make the presentation, the recording, and the paper available after this session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Onika and Busi, for leading us on to what I want to be a very interesting interaction amongst ourselves. So my job is quite easy, really, is to get Busi and Duma talking. And I know that they're capable of giving us more and responding so that we can get answers to how do we effect the changes that we would like to see in this country. Why has it taken us this long to make meaningful and substantive changes in as far as women are concerned? Why is it that with all the policy developments and formulations, the legislations that we have been told are progressive, but that has not changed the material conditions of the 52% of this population? Why is that the case? Now, when the work was done on the NSP and dealing with violence and literally finding out and teasing out the structural drivers of violence in this country, it was important, and it was not something that we could ignore, that the economy itself and the economic power that women don't have in this country contributes to gender-based violence. But how do we use that economic power if we were to get it? How do we use it to effect the changes that we want? So let me start with Busi and Duma. And Duma, good afternoon. We have not seen you. I haven't seen your face. Duma?
Hi, Brenda, how are you?
I'm good, and you? Gee,
Well.
you're looking dapper, like you are DA, yeah? Right? In your blue shirt,
oh,
right?
I see, okay.
Duma, let me start with you and ask the question. You have written numerous articles. You had been at pains to explain to all of us what Southern government is doing with its budget processes. And I read a week or two ago around austerity measures, but also around what this lockdown has done and continues to do to this economy. And Busi, in her presentation, in her concluding remarks, said we are in a crisis. Now, if we have these austerity measures and we were in a crisis, you as an economist, what do you think are the immediate interventions that we can embark on as a country that can, and I'm leading to this question, Duma, are we going to have to accept at some point as a country that the unemployment that we have, we can never, ever make substantive changes to those employment numbers? And in fact, we should be considering, as it has been happening, that people speak of a basic income grant, that we have to come to the realization and acceptance that this economy can never absorb all of us. We can never all be entrepreneurs. So let's have a frank and an acknowledgement that we'll have to, as a country, give out the money, so something that is meaningful to the population in this country. Your thoughts, Duma?
And thanks, Brenda. It's such a pleasure to see you looking so well. And,
I know.
It's such an honor to be here, the discussion being facilitated by yourself. You know, I was talking to my sister and she says, you know, Brenda is such a special person. You know, I've known her since university, and ever since university, she was taking up the causes of women who had been abused by their partners, and she's got a long history of activism. I just have one regret, that I didn't meet you earlier in my life. And I don't know why these things happen. And I'm also an honor to be with Busi, and Busi is like my mentor on feminist economics. And I just have to say that, you know, last year during the crisis, as we're trying to understand what is happening with the economy. There were like four, I think there was 4 budgets last year. And I discovered that there's only one person, that she's chair of the Budget Justice Coalition, who has read the budget more than I have. So we were invited, I've lost count how many panels we were invited to together. I remember one with the South African Communist Party and COSATU. I was exhausted, we were both exhausted, and we text each other, Labantu, can they not bring other people to talk about this matter? Why ask always the time? So, you know, so what I've learned, Brenda, from the little bit engaging with people like Busi, you must remember we don't study this at university, is that one of the issues, and Busi talked about it, is about the redistribution of the care work between men and also the public sector. So and Busi wrote an excellent paper just before the lockdown, which explained the austerity, how it works, and how it is counterproductive for our economy. In terms of the current budget, the cuts, so public services are crucial in terms of redistributing work in the care economy. So in the current budget, in the middle of a pandemic, we've cut the health budget by 50 billion rands, social grants by 36 billion rands, basic rands, and tertiary education 24.6 billion rands. Now you'll notice that the biggest cut is in health in the middle of a pandemic. And all of those cuts are the people who are going to be most affected are women. Just as well as Busi was going through the slides, Brenda, you know that we've also got another interest, the two of us, in issues of transformation and empowerment. I've just got my favorite statistics. And, well, it's not these are depressing statistics. Unemployment amongst Black Africans, the expanded definition is 51.5%. That is a crisis. It's a sign of an economy and a society that is unviable. The second issue that I love talking about, and Busi was talking about SME finance. I was reading the latest Banking Association report. What is it? 21 billion rands is the total financial sector balance sheet exposure to Black SMEs in terms of the charter requirements. That is 0.4% of banking assets. It's a truly shocking number. That is Black men and Black women, and you can be sure that the majority goes to Black men. And then the other one is that the Employment Equity Act, you know, Terry Oakley-Smith was texting me, and Tabia sent me the latest report. I couldn't join the discussion, but it's such depressing reading. But in my analysis over the years of that thing, what really used to pain me is that they are, the most marginalized people, top management, boards, whatever, is Black African women. And when I was doing work in the mining sector, the representation of white women was about 4 to 5 times the Black African woman in the mining sector in management levels. So we were arguing at the time that the whole category of HDSA in mining should be abolished. Yeah. So that is some of my opening remarks. And I really believe that we have to talk about quotas now. I argue with the BMF all the time that it must have quotas for women. There's a conservative minister in Norway. He decided, I'm tired of this, you know, and we're having a quota in Norway, 40% women on boards, and it's your problem, it's not my problem. 3 years, if you don't do it, we're gonna deregister you. So many countries have now gone the route of quotas for top management. So I argue with Tabia as well, all the time that Tabia, it's time for us to move beyond these voluntary Employment Equity Act targets. But anyway, that's the other issue. Now, in terms of restructuring of the whole economy, because our issue here is to restructure the whole economy. And there's a couple of things that have now become very important to me. We have to have universal public services. And what I mean by that, there has to be free quality, and there must be, let's start with education and health, okay? So there must be free quality education and health. This is from basic education to tertiary. And I've been working on the top costing of free tertiary education and basic education. So that is the first thing. Now, we can't postpone anymore the equalization of our unequal education and health systems. Now, what does it require in practical terms to equalize the education system? We must have the same learner-educator ratio in public schools as we have in private schools. So that means we must employ, let's say, 400,000 teachers to achieve that. I'm just using that for argument's sake. And one of the most painful things for me during the lockdown is how my helper's child the education stopped. And then my son, his education continued unaffected with our broadband, our fiber connection, and it didn't really affect him. And the helper's child, used to come while she's working here, and my son is studying, and her child wasn't doing anything at school. So that is one of, and we as South Africans have to say no more of this, no matter what, okay? And then the other thing on education is that my son's primary school, I mean, it was quite amazing primary school. They believed in Eastern philosophy. He had like 3 meals a day, vegetarian, and they did meditation and so forth. And by the time he went to primary school, I realized, no, man, this to high school. None of that was there anymore. Everything you have to pay for aftercare, you have to give lunch boxes. It was a nightmare, and I wasn't used to it anymore. But anyway, so we have to equalize the 2 education systems. And the second thing is the health system, and we have to equalize the 2 health systems. You know, many years ago, I had a car accident, and I decided I'm going to Edenvale in my area. Yeah. And I'm going to see what I was boycotting private healthcare at the time. And, you know, yeah, I felt strongly about it. So I went to Edenvale Hospital. But anyway, but the point is, we have to equalize the education system and the health system, whereby if you go to Bedford, say I live near Bedford View, if you go to Bedford Gardens Hospital, or during COVID, and my helper is sick, she must be able to go to Bedford Gardens or Edenvale Hospital, whichever is better. Now, what does it require for us to equalize our health system? To equalize our health system, let me just finish with education. No, I'll come back. No, health, sorry. Equalizing our health system, I looked at OECD benchmarks for doctor population ratios and nurse population ratios. Now, to equalize and we achieve the OECD benchmarks, we're talking about 150,000 doctors, and we're talking about 300,000 nurses. And I'm not even talking about the infrastructure spending that we must do in terms of that. Now, what will it take? The per capita spending in medical aids is about, I think it's 20,000 rands per capita in 2019. And in the public sector, it's per person, it's just about 4,500. So it's about 5 times more in the private sector versus the private sector. Now, equalizing them, if we have a proper national health insurance system, let's forget about this ANC government and for just a thought experiment, and let's forget about the corruption. What it would take if we had to equalize the 2 at that? So we would have to, theoretically, because there'd be savings from economies of scale, we would have to do it at about 2/3 of the cost of the private sector, because there's buying power, procurement power, elimination of waste of medical aids, advertising expenditure, and all that. So I estimated that the shortfall between the current budget of 200 billion and what we need to do, 600 billion, is about 400 billion rands per year. Because I got really sick of, you know, Mutsaledi. For many years, he couldn't get his head around the economics of national health insurance. And he was passionate, but you know, someone was, no, I won't mention this. But yeah, he was passionate about it, but he never got his head around the economics and he allowed Treasury to run rings around. So we must have that, number 2. And so we must equalize our education health system. That'll employ many people in terms of, and we also need teacher assistants, as we saw with the presidential employment stimulus. And then the third thing we need to do is we need to have subsidized and mass public transport. We have to have, I'm talking about part of the green transition that Busi said, we have to get rid of all these taxis and replace them with green vehicles. I'm talking about like more than 100,000. And we have to set up the public trains, and also we have to have mass affordable housing. And I'll talk about this a little bit. So in Australia, the Green Party has a proposal for a People's Bank backed by the Central Bank of Australia. Now, what we would do there, I would say, is that we have to take, you know, some time ago I was invited by the DG of Public Service. They have a problem there that most of the public servants have got bad credit records and they can't get housing, so they can't take advantage of the housing subsidy. The PIC had invested in a private sector company and people weren't taking it. But I said, like, no, DG, don't you understand that as the public service, you can't offer the same thing that Standard Bank is offering
Exactly.
And First Rand is offering. It has to be cheaper. So you should have a window at the central bank where you provide to this public bank, let's say a 2% interest with a margin, let's say, I'm just using this for argument's sake, 3% to this public bank, which is now going to finance cheaper housing for people. And I decided, let's get rid of this gap housing thing. Let's say everything below R1 million will be provisioned maybe publicly and so forth. So that's number 3. So this public bank would also be involved in financing the transition towards the new environmentally friendly taxis and the public health system and so forth. That's number 2. And number 3. So those are some of the, so we need free quality education and health, subsidized mass housing, and that mass housing, I mean, we have to get rid of these houses, anything below R1 million. So we have to take business out of the private banking system into that. That's what I would say. That's number 2. Number 3 is that UBI, you talked about it, United, you know, I've been in meetings now with people this is your stuff, Brenda, about bringing a case for basic income grants. So we were talking I had a meeting with Dennis Davis on Sunday, and then yesterday we had a meeting with advocate, what's his name? You know these guys, the white guy. Jesus Christ, I forget his name. He's he's the counsel for the president and all that. In the government. No, the other one. No, Stula, man. I forget his name, yeah. But anyway, we've been discussing this, yeah. So anyway, so the thing is, there's different scenarios. And he says, he gave us back to, he was the counsel for the Neverapine case. Yeah. And then he says that because now we're tired of talking to government, it's time to go to court, you know? So, yeah. So now the thing is, so he says, you have to introduce a category of people who you're going to take to the court. In Neverapine, we introduced pregnant women and so forth. So we said, I am 100% certain that at the food poverty line, there is no argument, 585 rands a month, there's no argument against having a basic income grant. I won't even go into the technical issues around it. Busi's organization has shown how we could pay for it, and I disagree with them that we don't have to pay for all of it. Some of it can be funded through debt and some of it through money creation by the central bank. So that's number 2. Now the third thing that I think we have to talk about, and it's only come to me recently, you know, my father, I'm a preacher's kid. And you know, I was very skeptical of the church and all that. And I wish my parents had introduced me to Martin Luther King. You know, Martin Luther King was a democratic socialist before there was Bernie. And if they introduced me to the theology of Martin Luther King, I would have joined the church much earlier, you see. But so Martin Luther King, throughout his life, he was a campaigner, he was a radical guy. He campaigned for what he called guaranteed income and a job guarantee. And he says, why can't we have both? So in terms of the legal thing about I won't go into the technicalities about the basic income grant. What most civil societies talk about, you should start at the food poverty line, move up to the lower bound poverty line, and then eventually progressive realization. It's in the constitution towards the upper poverty line. So now at the upper poverty line, it's 1,268 per person. So you eliminate poverty in 3 years. That's number 1. Yeah, or whatever the transition periods towards basic income is, which is what I'm saying. So we eliminate poverty directly that way. And that's what I've learned from the feminist economics and there's also some of the green people, that you should not obsess with GDP. You know, sometimes we have to obsess with GDP because we're engaging with neoliberalism on its own terms. So we have to use the word GDP, but you know that GDP is not, as Busi was saying, it's a flawed measure of well-being. So that's the second one. Now imagine that you're getting this basic income grant. You probably will also want a job. Do you see what I'm saying? So the second thing I have to say is that the minimum wage was set at a level far below what most South Africans would agree is a living wage. So I believe that we could have a UBI. Now, these things are seen as competing proposals. I think we can have them both. And a job guarantee. Now, I won't go into the details of the job guarantee. There'll be a lot of jobs created through universal public services, so that everybody's kids should have the services in the public sector like my child had in primary school, which costs lots more people and lots more money. And that's number 1. And then so the job guarantee would be phased in as well over a certain number of years. So, because if you get this 1.3, you've eliminated poverty, but people want a job. So you set a floor in the labor market at the living wage, which we still have to determine what is the living wage. So that's number three. That's number three. So I believe, so now the living wage, this would eliminate working poor category in our society and lift everyone's work, exploitative work in the gig economy, and the Uber drivers and all these people who get exploited. So we should set another floor. So we have two dignity floors for our country, at the poverty level through basic income, and at the living wage through a job guarantee. And then the final one that I've been talking about, that I've been thinking about, is this transition towards green. You know, Ash, Mina, I must confess, I thought this was a luxury thing, Yabelungu, about this environmental thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so most of us think it's a luxury for rich white kids in the north, about Greta Thunberg and all that. But there's a opportunity for us to create mass employment. You know, I've done a scenario where what will it take to achieve full employment by 2030? We have to create 17 million jobs. So then I say, what is the easiest way to do that? Not easiest, like, so we've talked about universal public services. The transition to green, let's exit the coal. Let's exit the coal at Eskom. Let's exit the coal at Sasol. And then let's exit all related industries. But in the meantime, let's just put up this new infrastructure. You saw with embedded generation, they said, I was talking to Roger Baxter, 5 megawatts, 5 gigs we can do in 2 to 3 years. So why can't we do 50 in 10 years if we have the public sector? So that's the thing. So finally, so those are the things that I've talked about. So when you're in Mpumalanga and you're going to be affected by this transition, it should be obvious to you that you benefit. There'll be a basic income, and there'll be free provisioning of education for health. So I'm imagining a different society than the one we have now. And then finally, I want to say, I won't talk about financing, but that is my baby. I want to, in this webinar we had with Dennis Davis, he tried to take me on, but I can't. So that's why, like, so basically, I've put forward about 11 proposals as to how we can finance these things, because I'm not a populist. And there's the central bank, we need a developmental central bank that's going to finance these things, And we need so the central bank can provide financing at no cost. It can find prime financing on favorable terms. It can also financing on commercial terms. So there's a whole array of funding things that we have to talk about as a country. Some of them involve higher taxes. And I'm trying to calculate how much we can raise through a financial transactions tax. We've got the deepest financial markets of maybe most developing countries. You know, the last thing I want to say, the reason why I could predict, unlike most economists, that nothing would happen when we're downgraded is that I understand how deep our financial markets are. They were talking about an exit of money of about, I can't remember, 200 billion, 300 billion. But the turnover on a foreign exchange reserves, of markets, is about 150 per day. Do you see what I'm saying? So if we can find, if you can have, so now if there's an exit of 300 billion, it's 2 days of turnover on our forex market. So if we have this tax of, let's say, 0.5% on the buy side and 0.5% on the sell side, it could also raise a lot of money. I'm still calculating how much that would cost. But I think we have to start imagining a complete, so Busi was saying feminism is a critique of capitalism. We must start imagining a different type of society to the one that we have now. Our society now is completely broken. And anybody who doesn't realize it, it's unviable, it's a broken society, there's gender-based violence. And South Africans, my last thing is that we are violent people. You know, a friend of mine, she went to live in the US and I was asking her, why did you do this? She says, she just got tired of all the harassment every day, you know, and on the streets of Joburg, you know, you get on the taxis and whatever, and it was just too much anyway. So I just think we have to imagine a completely different society in terms of relationships between men and women, between people and the state, between people and the markets. We can't allow free market capitalism to reign everywhere. This excessive financialization where you have to pay for your education, you have to pay for your aftercare, you have to pay for the You have to pay for the tutor. I'm now paying for a tutor for someone to teach my kid maths.
You must pay for
much. Yeah.
So and I'm gonna come back to that, Duma, but I want to bring in Busi on that specifically. That we want to reimagine a society that is feminist in its approach, even a feminist economy that you talked about earlier, Busi. How do we go about doing that? Bearing in mind that almost all of us in this session this afternoon, we have been active one way or the other in trying to reimagine a society that is compassionate, that is trustworthy, that is caring, that is kind. However, it's driven by masculinity that tells you that for you to be successful, you have to amass material possessions, and you amass them at all costs at the expense of others and underpaying others, right? So how do we reimagine and we bring to the fore those who have, and we elect those who can have an understanding of a reimagined society? Because at the moment, I don't see anyone capable of doing this in this country, other than the few of people who are researchers, who are analysts, who understand what needs to be done, but the leadership, and when I speak of leadership, I'm not just talking to political leadership, I'm talking about almost all of us who are leaders in our respective fields and organizations. So how do we reimagine that, Busi?
Oh, the $1 million question. Duma can tell you, I was asking him the same question recently. I said, Duma, what would it take to shift the needle? What will it take? I think one of the things that is critical to start with is to say that, to acknowledge that having a parliament, for example, or leadership that is 50% women does not necessarily translate to pro-women policies. And I think that is something that we have to acknowledge in all spaces, right? Inclusivity is not just about representation of physical people, but inclusivity is also deeply about representation of ideas. Different types of thinking, and I think we're deeply lacking in that. So I do think that more, and of course I understand the challenges. Once you're in the system, you're probably indoctrinated into believing whatever it is that is being taught there. But to say that, I think we have to push for inclusivity in thinking. So when you're voting for a person there, it's not, we want a woman who is also a feminist. Like, that should be, the two-in-one kind of package. But that's the first. The second one is that the thing about this conversation is that to change economies, we have to change economics itself. And that is very difficult to do, because we're talking about a system that has been deliberately designed to exclude one, right? Traditionally, economists are the ones who've got all the answers. We all look to the economist, like, what is the economist going to say about GDP? And so it is by design that it's been left to the economocrats. But I love this great quote by, I think it's Hajim Chan. He says that, economics is far too important to be left to economists alone. And I think that one of the things that we have to do systematically as a country is to mass educate in a particular way. To mass, every single person should be able to engage at least at some level about economic discussions, because if people can engage in economic discussions, you'll see different outcomes and expectations. For instance, even in the participatory processes, there are very few organizations that engage in post-budget analysis. And we need more of that, right? Like, we need more and more participation and creating spaces of participation. For me, municipality, or rather activism at the municipal level, to me, is currently what I think is the way to tackle the system. I don't know how realistic this is, but I do think that, I look at the Makanda situation and I say, look, these are a group of people who said, you're not provisioning, this is the budget, we are going to select who we want to provision this, these basic services. And I think if we could replicate that across, imagine if in every municipality in South Africa, there was somebody who could look at the municipal budget and say, this is not what we deserve, you're not doing enough, you're not having the right people. Accountability has to step up, and accountability at the national level accountability at the provincial level, accountability at the local levels really needs to be ramped up in a very different way, and ways that are challenging. And I always think this is only successful if you've got bottom-up and top-down approaches. I think the treatment action campaign was successful because of all these different ways in which it was tackled. There was legal action, there was, protests on the ground, there was a lot going on. But to say that there's no one way in which we can achieve that. But I think the last thing I'll end on is to say, we have to capture people's imaginations, but we also have to meet the material needs. So it is difficult, if you are thinking, what is my next meal, to be also now thinking about what is the new economy of South Africa going to look like. And the only way we can change and enable, what are the material things people need to be able to be in that space? And I'm not talking intellectual material needs, but like, what is it that people need today, now, to be able to engage at that level that we're expecting? And so I think that is critical to say, whatever imaginings we have, those tend to be kind of long-term. We want a society where there's a radical redistribution of paid work, but it's like, what does Busi need in her life right now to facilitate with that unpaid care work, so she can also imagine in this larger project? So yeah, those are my initial thoughts on that, but it's $1 million question.
It is $1 million question, Busi and Duma, but something has to give. I don't want us to be back here a week later, a month later, 6 months later, saying the same things, right? With no tangible action from all of us on how, if we truly believe that gender-based violence is a pandemic, that we are in a crisis as a country, that the austerity measures that have been put in place are literally obliterating and making it worse for majority African women. I, and those of us who are party to this webinar, want concrete action to be taken. And we will need to collaborate, form collaboration efforts with all the other organizations, and mount an action that is going to bring about the changes that we desire. And Duma, you've given us 4 things that we could be looking at. Some of them you've been working on them, as recent as a week or 2 ago. And I hear you on the public transport, and let me just touch on public transport. The majority of Black people use public transport. Women find themselves using public transport. They get harassed, sexually violated using public transport, right? And if we are to build a credible, safe public transport that takes into account a gender lens, because at the moment, almost everything that we do is the default is men, and so women are secondary in the planning and in monitoring and execution of anything else. So we think of men first, and men think for themselves first on what will work for them, and that's happening. So how do we get individuals who have got a different thinking, my people? Really, I mean, for me, it's the thinking in this country, the level and the quality of engagement is quite pedestrian. And when you listen to those who've got power to make decisions on our behalf, the thinking is quite limited and is narrow. And as I said earlier, Duma and Busi, I want a movement that is going to shape, that is going to force, that is going to literally get all of us from our butts off and get us to work for the betterment of this country, because we understand what is at stake. And I'm saying this, it's a comment, but you know what I'm referring to, and I just want to hear you how out of this process, those of us who participated in this webinar, what is going to be my role? What action can I take as a fellow South African, as a woman activist, as a survivor of violence? Where do I find myself, and how do I make this contribution?
Is that me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, oh, that's a difficult one. You know, the public transport, you know, someone was telling me that talked to a student at university and what it took for that student to get to university from, what it took to get from Orange Farm to the university campus, how many taxis you take, and how much harassment you get along the way, which is maybe 90 minutes on the different taxis. Yeah. So how do we imagine a different transport system? I actually don't know, but I don't know. Maybe, you know, during COVID, we saw that you can't continue to pack so many people in the taxis. You know, so you need obviously different. You know, you need to have a different size of vehicle that is. Yeah, I don't know what it is. You know, back in the day, I used to be advisor to the Department of Transport, and we spent many years, many months, like about 2 years, discussing this taxi recap that never happened. And during that period, I learned that, you know, in many South American countries, they have a recap of their taxes every decade. They just get rid of everyone, and then they get new ones, you know. And so, I mean, we have to imagine. So, as Busi was saying, we have to imagine at the level, at the local level, at the individual level, what does change mean for me as Thandi, who lives wherever in Orange Farm? So we must, I don't know, like the intersection of all these crises, these overlapping crises in our society that affect so many people. And we have to see the commonality between these crises, because I've been amazed how I see the feminist critique of capitalism. It's the same, similar in many ways to the environmental, the degrowth critique of capitalism. And many people are using the same tools. But the last thing I want to say is that I've learned from the Fees Must Fall people that, you know, such movements must be, I don't want to use the word across party political.
Right.
You know, I've been called by the DA people to, I don't know why they come to me. I've been called by, last year I addressed the Communist Party 5, 6 times, 7 times with Busi half of the times. ANC. I don't operate according to political parties. I'm prepared to talk to everybody across politics, because there are good people in every single party. Let's be honest, yeah. So that's what I learned from the Fees Must Fall, that you organize around the issues, and the politicians, they must follow us. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. So you must have the politicians say, we can't not have this issue in our campaign, because it is the public has now mobilized around this issue. If the public says, we're tired of this education system, we're tired of this health system, so I don't know, like so I talk to all the political parties, and the UDM, Misa, whatever, you know. So I pride myself in that, you know, people talk to me across, everybody talks to me, and I don't know,
All right. In closing, and I want your closing remarks, and I'll start with Duma, and then you'll be the sweeper, Busi. Is to one, Busi referred to GDP and how we measure it, and at the moment we measure it in the traditional way, economist way. Is there an alternative way of measuring GDP, Duma? Right? And as you respond, I want you also to talk to us about the role of the trade union in shaping the thinking that we're talking about now, right? And
I'll start with the second one, and then the GDP one, You know, as I said, like I've presented to SAFTU, and I've presented to the other side, COSATU. I've worked for both sides of the unions, like Busi. And I was at a workshop just before COVID on ESCOM, and we were discussing those NUM people, those NUMSA people, and the NUM and NUMSA were there, united. So it went on for 2-3 days. And then I asked them over coffee, now you guys are not fighting together. What is the issue? Said, no, we're united on our issues at ESCOM, but the problem is not us. The problem is our leaders. And since it's the egos of the male leaders. Actually, I'm not simplifying things. This is basically what's happening. So I came to the view at the time that, no, man, we have to have a reset at all levels in leadership. The problem in the union movement and I say it without fear of contradiction, is the male fragility and, you know, toxic masculinity of the male leaders in that sector. We have to reimagine the trade union movement. Yeah, and you know, there's amazing. We need a new generation of leaders in the trade union movement. And I'll say this: Jim has lost the passion. Pagamile Shubi must take over. Majola must take over. Yeah, he's non-existent.
I'm with you.
And I have to say that. Yeah. So that is the type of thing that I'm talking about. And in terms of GDP, as I was saying, you know, a lot of time I spend my time engaging in the private sector, business day readers, and so forth. And you have to use GDP and engage neoliberalism on its own terms. But we are aware, especially in the recent work that I'm doing, that GDP is a deeply flawed measure of human well-being. And there are very many alternative indicators of human well-being. And the one I liked recently was the Donut Economics of Kate Raworth. I don't know how to pronounce the name, where she talks about the ecological, she's got a donut economy where there's an ecological ceiling with 9 planetary boundaries at the edge of this donut. And the inner ring of the donut is 12 basics of life that everybody must have. So everybody must be lifted above the basics of life, which is education, healthcare, sanitation, and so forth. But we must do that to lift everybody along those limited, sustainable development goals of the United Nations without harming the ecological ceiling. So there are many alternative measures. There's one in India, I forget what it's called. The lady in New Zealand, the Prime Minister, she's got a wellness budget in New Zealand, and we've got the gross national happiness in Bhutan. So I think, yeah, we have to develop alternative measures of well-being. And what I've learned is that instead of targeting GDP, you target well-being directly through your and the biggest link between well-being is universal public services. If I'm getting universal public services, I don't need that big salary. If I'm getting public transport, I don't need a big car. And so we can learn to live with less. That's what I believe.
Thank you, Duma. Busi, you take it home for us with everything.
Yeah, no, I think, there's a lot to be done. To me, I'd argue that the austerity measures that are going to be implemented, and austerity meaning budget cuts primarily that are happening, are actually probably the one thing that impacts us all, no matter, you know, all of us actually, like even business, even though business is like, yes, the debt is too hard, but guess what? When government cuts budget, it means less procurement, which means less business for them too. So I think austerity really, to me, and maybe it's because I'm biased, I write a lot about austerity, and to say that is one thing that we can unify on. And you know, it is something that we have to fight very hard because it's been in motion since 2014-15 and it's now being accelerated. And in fact, we are late to the party almost. You know, the organizations, you know, the first article on South Africa is implementing austerity was in 2012 by Tobo Madongo. We are late to the party. Government is already accelerating this thing and it's going to really impact women particularly, right? Because they rely on these social services more for social reproduction. Disproportionately harder. We see that our economy is not performing. So what is austerity going to do? It's going to make it worse, and so forth. And I think that is, and I mean, we can unite it around other things. We can unite around hunger. Hunger is increasing. We actually are going to see a humanitarian crisis. But of course, the challenge here is how do you organize? How do you advocate during a time of COVID? And I wanted to add to what Duma was saying about the unions, to say that there's interesting research done in the UK about how austerity works hand in hand with the undermining of unions and the dismantling of power within unions. And so to think about this, to say that economic power thrives by disempowering even structures that are supposed to be of power. And the question fundamentally is, how do you reclaim those spaces? I mean, we see now that National Treasury is saying they want to implement gender responsive budgeting, but we have to reclaim gender responsive budgeting because the way they are proposing probably isn't what we had in mind. We mustn't accept a piecemeal, right? They're going to come to change our minds and so forth. So I think it's really also about reclaiming civil society power. That's actually one of the critical things. You know, without civil society power, we won't win over economic power because we won't be able to shift the thinking, the needle around what policies, what ideas, if, you know, there's no civil society power that is together actually, you know. So I agree as well, new ideas are needed. I say that the space has aged me rapidly, so even newer ideas than me are needed. So we need, you know, where are the 24-year-olds who come out of university and are bright-eyed and are willing to be in these spaces and come up with even better ideas, is also critical. And organize us better, people with the energy.
Yeah,
organize us.
that's not true. And I see Pelisa is asking the question. I mean, I like what she's asking, to say, can we stop being referred to as a middle income country in the midst of 49% unemployment? I mean, that is telling in itself, right? There's Michelle Jewell who's saying, you know, as this country has said, GBV is a pandemic. However, the programs that are introduced at grassroots level are being affected because of the budget cuts, right? So where do organizations go to continue to provide the services that they're providing to victims of violence? So these are some of the things that we, hopefully out of this engagement, we're going to have a discussion on how we mount a legal challenge to some of these things, right? And see how far we can go to force the state to, and all the state actors to do as they are supposed to. So are there any other questions from the participants? Onika, any question that has been posed that maybe Duma and or Busi can respond to?
There's certainly a lot of comments, and I just want to say that we are going to save the chat and reshare it with all the resources from this conversation, because there's actually been quite a rich conversation going on in the chat box. So thank you so much for engaging that way as well. So I don't see any specific questions, but if anyone wants to raise their hand quickly, we can definitely perhaps take one. I see Gregory, your hand is up. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you just now. Go ahead and unmute yourself, actually. Gregory, I can't see the full name.
It's younger. Okay, thanks. I think Duma have raised a quite important aspect, same as well as the leader of the discussion grouping as well, that what we need to do, that we need to start looking into a number of things. You mentioned NUMSA and NUM. Let's look into the mining sector. I'm going to take, for instance, the Northern Cape as an example now. We got one of the highest unemployment rates in the province, and which is not the true reflection of the unemployment rate. People work in the Northern Cape, get retrenched, go to Mpumalanga, Gauteng, stays there, get the benefits. The point I'm raising to you is that a number of economic activities are happening in the various provinces, but realize that the beneficiary of those economic activities are not then the population which are benefiting. And then when you go to the banking sector as well today, the banking sector is more worried about a thing called the systems happening, called ITC, called Experian, called that, to assess then the SME sector. Now, when you look into women issues today, that's how then we are driving women issues in this country. We're driving women issues like they're actually at credit bureaus. We don't drive women issue through budgeting monitoring tools in the country. And that's the frustration point of a lot of women who are actually unemployed. The same basis that we need to look today, basically that in 128 million given by government for gender-based violence, which is actually a joke. Because when you look into gender-based violence in the country today, we start losing almost 48 billion rands in the economy in terms of GDP. But we're sitting with 128 million rands dealing with the aspect as well that. That's, to me, gives you then a problem of dealing with that. How then do we deal with the problem instead dealing with a symptom which doesn't make sense?
And I mean, and to Gregory's point, Busi and Duma, you would know, and I know, Duma, you did write an article around this 1.6 billion that was earmarked for GBV interventions, right? And then there was an announcement of another private sector fund for GBV, but also you have an NSP that has to be implemented. And to date, we do not have a clear indication of allocation of monies to ensure that that strategic plan is a reality. And can I just hear your comments on that, flowing from what Gregory said?
You are muted, Duma.
Last week when I saw my name on the program, I asked Busi, hey Busi, what am I going to talk about, and why am I on the panel? And she says, no, you can talk about the issues that you're talking about, Brenda. So to cut a long story short, in September 2019, there was a joint sitting of Parliament where the President made this announcement around the 1.6 billion rands. And over the months, I began to notice that nobody's talking about it. Everyone's talking about the missing 500 billion rand stimulus. So I decided to start writing. The BJC, Busi, they went to Parliament so many times. But to cut a long story short, the President again, when he launches the fund this morning, and on the 4th of February, the 128 that Gregory is talking about, he committed 128, he committed 21 billion to address GBVF. And then a week later, in the State of the Nation address, he addressed 12 billion. So the CGE came with a report recently, last month, everybody should read it. They say we can't find this 1.6 billion. Yeah. They said most of the targets, 81 targets, were not achieved in terms of the ERAP. And then your collective as well did a what you call it, a study on this thing, and you gave a scorecard of F. I've been engaging with the presidency, and to cut a long story short, the 1.6, if you look at the elements of the ERAP, they don't add up to 1.6, they add up to 1.1, okay? Yeah. That's number one. Number two, the president sent me a spreadsheet, and so first the CGE said, Tina, no government department could tell us the story. Everybody was avoiding us. We were kicked away from meetings at the presidency. It was a mess. So when I talked to the presidency, they told me off the record, we had the same situation with the same government departments. So anyway, there's a spreadsheet they sent me, you'll laugh. So 800 billion, 889 billion is the NPA. Now, you go to the NPA annual report, you can't see this money. And then 200 billion is from the police. Yeah. And they claim to have spent 220 billion rands in it's called tools of trade for the FCS. So yes. They bought cars and cell phones. So they went on a spending spree, buying cars and cell phones, which don't address the issue of GBV in these. I don't know. So I'm following up on that one as to what on earth were they talking about? Yeah. So then the other one is the 21 and 12. So the presidency tells me the 21 refers to 21 is the correct number. Yeah. And then you look at the spreadsheet they send me, I had a headache. I think half of it relates to the Department of Human Settlements, where they give women title deeds and houses. So allegedly, but you go to the annual report and the budget vote. So all these commitments, to cut a long story short, they don't exist in any budget vote and I look at all of them, and Busi does as well. And then the last thing I want to say, Department of Small Business, they say we're spending 3.8 billion rands. You go to the allocation in the budget for the whole department over 3 years, medium-term expenditure framework, it's way in excess of 3.8 billion. So I'm just saying that a lot of the numbers have been cooked, but over the next couple of weeks, I'll get to the bottom of the story.
All right, and we will really like to work with you on that. Busi, I know you have to step off in one minute or two, but let me hear your views quickly on all these monies that are floating all over the show.
No, Duma's spot on about that. And to say to Gregory, what I wanted to mention is this idea that this issue of people moving, or not an issue, but this comment around people moving and the economic benefits goes to the bigger issue, which is we don't actually capture how economies work, right? We don't sufficiently capture immigration. Even the budget doesn't, you know, capture immigration well. Gauteng is probably the province that has the highest, you know, levels of immigration. And the question is the budget keeping up? You know, because, you know, provinces get money based on this formula, which includes how many people and so forth. So does the budget take into account some of these factors? And so these are things we have to consider, and to say that, you know, countries are, obviously there's many economies within the economy, right? There is no one economy which then captures all. And I think these are serious things to be considered. And again, this is why we have to be intersectional, right? It is important that, you know, geography, South Africa again is not homogeneous. And so whatever policies you implement, you know, you can't treat someone who lives in, like even if it's a township in Gauteng, the same as someone who lives in a township in the Eastern Cape, because fundamentally the governance structures are, you know, the leadership is different, the budget is different, what kind of priority programs are there are also different sometimes, you know. So again, to bring back, I think that's an important point, to bring back intersectionality into even how we discuss these things, which is why I actually bring back to this, we need to all, you know, fight one thing, but it is also important that we still have identities that are community-based, that are, you know, grouped around certain things, because then, yes, we win the broader conversation, but then maybe our issues at the local level are not addressed. So both fights are important, to acknowledge what is needed at the national level and what is the local, and what needs to be factored into that historical, and I spoke about the history of South Africa generally, but feminist analysis will say historical, contextual, socioeconomic, political factors that are very context specific. And we could write thousands of papers about different communities in South Africa from a historical perspective, context, and I think that has to be emphasized.
No, thank you. I mean, I can sit with both of you for days on end trying to come up with solutions, and I would love to do that. So when I'm fully recovered, I'm going to host a session where we can really exploit some of the ideas that came out of your presentations this afternoon, and really see how we can push the envelope in challenging the power structures at the moment. You know, we've got leaders of the world meeting in Paris as from tomorrow on generation equality. Over 100 years, we've been talking about the same thing: gender equality, gender equality, gender equality. Absolutely nothing happening. And women have been in the forefront, standing up to fight for the recognition of their rights and protection of their rights. And we are given, you know, some crumbs every year to appease you, and you must shut up. And then next year you are back again to argue for same things and fight for the same things. So I think where we are, most of us, is that we are exhausted with this piecemeal approach. We're looking for something fundamental, so that I don't invite Duma 6 months from now, a year from now. I don't have a conversation with Busi and say, but where did we go wrong? I mean, we all have it in us now. We have solutions, and can we push to get the solutions going? We only but have this country, some of us, and if it gets messed up, we've got no hope in hell. And we are the only ones who can try and ensure that it works, and it works for the better and for the benefit of the millions of South Africans, majority being African women. So thank you very much, Duma and Busi. As I indicated, I will do that. I'll hand over to Onika, and thank you to Masimanyane, Wise, Teddy Bear, Nisa for entrusting us with this session. And I think it was very insightful and impactful. So I'm very happy I can go to bed now. Thank you, Onika.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for hanging in here. I know we've gone a lot over time, but Brenda, you've summed it up so beautiful. I don't think I need to say much. One thing that just really stood out for me in this conversation, I believe Busi said this to us, that feminism is a critique of capitalism. And as we get ready to disband, I hope that we remember that. But another thing, I think we got a challenge out of this conversation as well today, and that is about having an inclusive conversation about the economy and not leaving it up to just the economists, but making sure that in our conversations around these issues, we bring everyone along, and lastly, I think we were challenged to be non-partisan and movement and focus, centering the issues that are critical and important for us. And as promised earlier, we will try to summarize this conversation and send it to all of you, including the beautiful comments that we have in the chat box as well. We have made sure we've saved those. So we will share that in addition to the recording from today, as well as Busi's paper and the presentation that she made. Thank you very much, everyone. We will, till next time.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Duma. Thank you, Busi.
Thank you.
Thank you.